Good evening and welcome to the Legion Cantina. In today's episode, we'll be talking about 5 mistakes I see beginner players making in Star Wars Legion and how you can avoid them. So, we're just going to talk about mistakes that beginner players and more experienced players can both make in the game, and just how you can avoid making those in your games. Now, some of these aren't strictly based on in-game mistakes. They can be your approach to the game, how you're thinking about the game more generally. And obviously, these are not the only mistakes that people do make in the game. These are just kind of the ones that I think, like, if I could go back in time and tell myself when I started my Legion journey, these are probably the ones I would have thought about most importantly. So, the first one is going to be focusing too much on winning. There is a lot to get used to in Legion these days, and even for people who've played the previous version, there's a huge sort of learning curve up to just sort of the pace of New Legion and the kind of the way you have to play the game. So definitely, I think early on, it's very easy to think about trying to optimize my list, trying to make sure I have the best possible chance of winning. But I actually think, and I think I touched on this in my starter box video as well, I think so much of the early experience of Legion is about working out, firstly, whether or not the game is for you, not Legion isn't for everybody, it won't be fun for everybody, but also, what units you want to play into, how you want to play the game, because everybody has a different journey in Legion and in all games. And I think focusing too much on the competitive side and how you can go about winning your games is maybe not the way to go. And if nothing else, you're not going to win every game you play. Even the best players in the world obviously aren't going to win every game they play, and I don't think you can go into every game expecting to win, because sometimes you can just key rolls can go against you and things like that, and that is just part of the game, unfortunately. This also plays into list building as well. So too many people, I think, try and optimize a list and think about whether or not a unit is good. And it's absolutely valid to do that when you're thinking about a tournament, or if you're a more competitive player further down the line. But definitely at the start, just trying to get an experience across a breadth of different units, both competitive and non-competitive, is valid. And melee units, long range units, vehicles, if you can borrow or make use of these units in game, I think that's a really good way to experience it. And it's all part of learning, right? If somebody came in and won every game, then there's probably something wrong with the game. If a new player is able to come in and win every game, I think also by optimizing your list as much as possible, you kind of put pressure on yourself to, you almost have to win the game. If you have this really competitive, well optimized list, it can sometimes feel like the list is carrying you rather than winning despite the list that you're playing. And I think there is definitely something to be said for maybe taking a suboptimal list and getting those, little wins where maybe you don't go and win a whole tournament, but if you take a dreadful list and you're able to go 2-1, for instance, that can feel as big an achievement as taking a fully optimized list and winning a whole tournament. So yeah, there are just different approaches to kind of that more competitive side of things. And also, just because a list is competitive, I've said this a bunch of times, just because a unit or a list is competitive doesn't necessarily mean it'll be mesh with your playstyle or you'll fully be able to utilize it. I've played a lot of games of Legion at this point, and there's still definitely units like Op Luke, like Vader, for instance, who I just don't think I can still get full value from. I'm not terrible with those units, but there are definitely games where I'm I've just wasted points here and not played particularly well. So even though a unit is good, it doesn't necessarily mean you're able to extract full value from it. Tied into this is, at the start of playing Legion, it's only natural that you're not going to understand what's going on. Legion has a lot of slightly quirky rules and wordings, especially with the new wording that's designed to be clearer. Clearer in some ways, but also in some ways there's a lot of ambiguity. And perhaps the English language just isn't fully set up to support the way that the devs want to describe Star Wars Legion. But absolutely just ask questions. If I regularly post on group chats and look at the FAQs and things like that, because there are just little things like what order do things happen in, can you get an aim off tactical off a climb and things like that. These are not necessarily intuitive, and that's absolutely fine to not understand those things. And quite often you'll talk to fairly experienced players and they won't understand those things either, and there can be different interpretations. So don't worry about not understanding things at first, because nobody understands everything in the game. And yeah, like it's better to ask before you take an action, or buy a unit, or use a list, so you understand what you're going into rather than trying to work it out or just fudging through. Like, check with people, check those FAQs, and you'll have like a much clearer, and you won't feel like you've kind of lost out as a result of something you thought would work isn't actually a combo in game. Moving on to like more specific things, going to talk about like in-game habits to avoid, and I think we all do these naturally sometimes, especially in like more casual pickup games. But it's good to be in like the best possible habits when you are playing the game, just so if you are in a tournament environment where you may be playing against somebody who you've not played before, you're not familiar with, it's good to just be super clear on like following the rules as well as possible, and you get into those good habits. So the first one is, if you are planning to move a unit and you're just looking at different options, avoid moving the leader of the unit until the latest possible moment, because in my view, as soon as you've moved the leader of that unit, even if you've left the stick there, you've kind of then committed to making that move, and it can then just be a bit awkward and a bit fiddly when like you have to take it back if something's not clear, or it can't move exactly where you wanted it to. So if you're planning a move, just slot the movement stick onto the front of the base, and then use another mini from the unit. They even mention this in the rules explicitly now that you can do this. So that's a really like clear way, and just means that if you actually don't like where that move leaves you, you can just take the stick away, and then you haven't actually committed to anything. And that again just makes things a bit clearer for everybody. And the next bit is to do with notch bases and movement. So just making sure that, especially when you paint them, sometimes it means the stick doesn't quite slot in. So it can sometimes help to just chip away or take a bit of that paint off the inside, just to make sure the stick can slot all the way in. But yeah, just making sure when you move the notch base, you hold it securely and slot the stick in, and then you hold that stick in place and then put the unit where you want it to end up. And again, that just makes it clearer. Like when units slide around, or if you knock something, again, it can just be a little bit awkward trying to work out where it should have gone. And that's, if you can avoid like that situation, that is again a really good habit to get into. The other thing is, like, if you've got tactical one, for instance, trying to get into the habit of putting those aims down as you do that move, even if you're planning to do like a move shoot, so you're planning to use that aim straight away, because sometimes it can just be a little bit tricky to keep track of maybe how many aims you've got, especially if you've got R force and you're planning to share the aims around. Just tracking exactly how many aims you have is a really good thing to do. So it can feel a bit silly sometimes, like if you're trying to use them straight away, but again, it is just a good habit to get into, to physically put those tokens down, because that is one of the benefits of Legion in tracking those things really explicitly. The other thing is, if you have my big one is Rebel Troopers and Commandos and Sleeper Cell. The way I've painted them is very similar, so it can sometimes be hard to tell them apart. So just having like loom bands or little base markers, at least to mark the leader, to show where you can move and what your sort of ranges are if you're planning to score an objective, that can be super helpful. And again, it doesn't have to be big things. Like you can get a pack of loom bands, like two or 300 for like a couple of quid off Amazon or eBay or something, and those can just be really nice for just dropping one on that leader if there is a case of potential confusion. And the final one is, and this is something is a little bit of a bugbear of mine, I get really annoyed when I forget my dice tray, because you end up rolling on terrain. It can just be a bit annoying. Is if you do have a dice tray, try your best to make use of it and make it clear to your opponent, like if a dice does bounce out of the tray, what you're going to do with that, because it prevents that slightly awkward one of like they're expecting you to take the dice back, whereas you're like, oh, it landed flat, so I can use that, right? That just say dice out the tray don't count, or if you're happy with dice out the tray do count, then that's absolutely fine. And talking about like cocked on terrain and things like that are all little things, so a dice tray can again just make things really clear. And like 99% of the games you play, these things won't be an issue, and you can do things in a way that feels natural. But again, in those sort of like, if you end up playing in with people you don't know or in a more competitive environment, just getting into these good habits will just make the game run that bit smoother. I will talk about some more competitive, more specific competitive things that might, and not give you an edge, because I'm not going to pretend that I have the answers to lots of competitive things, but these are just some things that, especially in the new version of Legion, I think are just good general things to think about. So the most important turn in the game by far is turn 1, and you cannot win the game on turn 1, but you can 100% lose it if you misplay or if you leave something positioned too aggressively. And especially with the access that some units have to like scout and movement and range now, you have to be really careful, and you have to think about what units you're willing to leave exposed in return for them getting a shot. So the old one used to be like Pathfinders, so you could infiltrate them, and then you often had the choice between aim shooting or then shooting and moving back into cover. And like things like that are just like the micro decisions that I think makes Legion such a good game. It's just like you can trade off that sort of position on the board that might leave you a bit exposed for that opportunity to deal a bit more damage. And just being aware on turn one that if you have, some shorter range units, they need to probably be behind a building in some heavy cover. Like if you leave them exposed, they are just going to get shredded, because unless you're playing against someone who only has range 2, which doesn't feel like a particularly good way to do things, you will be vulnerable to their sort of range 4 longer range threats. So turn 1 is huge, and it's better to be slightly too cautious than be slightly too aggressive, because the more acts you have into the late game, the more objectives you're going to score. And sometimes just having, a rebel trooper unit running around at the back can be the difference between winning and losing. So leaving them sort of out in the open on turn 1 and getting them shredded can ultimately lose you the game later on. The other one that's kind of tied to this is the objective of the game isn't to kill your opponent's models. That is something that helps you win the game, but that's not the objective of the game. And almost always, if you have the opportunity to score an objective, you should take it. There are some situations where if you have the opportunity, I don't know, with Sleeper Cell or Arcs or a big force user to get in there and deal some real damage, then it might be worth, giving up an objective. But if you've got a basic Rebel Trooper or a basic Stormtrooper unit at the back who have the opportunity between getting a shot off and scoring an objective, score the objective, because those troop units might do 1 or 2 hits, which might translate to a wound if you're lucky. Brilliant. Like that, you only need 12 EPs to win the game, so just prioritize that over almost everything. And while it isn't always like, it doesn't always feel great, it's a bit like hiding your really powerful units earlier in the game. You need those powerful units later in the game to help deal that damage and to help score you those objectives. In the same way, there's no point killing your opponent if they go up, they're scoring more points than you, and it doesn't matter if they've already won the game by turn 4, for instance, even though you have overwhelming numbers. So you can be way down on activations, but if you've gone a bit early game aggro and you've actually scored loads of points, then that's a decent trade-off. So you don't have to kill your opponent to win the game. The other thing is you can kind of get baited by your opponent maybe being a bit more aggressive into moving away from the strengths of your list. Like if you have lots of things that are good at sort of long to mid range, that's where you should try to engage. Don't get dragged into this sort of trying to, trade damage at range 2, because there are units that specialize in dealing damage up close and personal, and they will always, if they are able to shoot, outshoot those longer range units, because they just have more firepower, because they trade off that range for increased damage. So if you can avoid like getting into those sort of scrappy close range fights, if that's what your list doesn't want to do, then absolutely try and do it. And also think about how you're shaping your battle deck to try and emphasize those long range fights. So maybe a recover the research or shifting priorities, for instance, which can give those longer range units the ability to maybe camp on an objective while shooting your opponent. Whereas maybe like bunker assault or intercept signals might favour those more sort of up close and personal lists that deal more damage but at a shorter range. The final thing is the thing that I think I've really been thinking about recently in Legion is what's going to happen next turn. Because often during an actual turn of Legion, your turns are kind of, it's fairly obvious what you should be doing in kind of an optimal way on this turn. But if you are thinking about then what's going to happen next turn and how you're actually going to go on and win the game, that gives you the advantage sort of moving forward. So you're kind of surrendering maybe a bit of optimization for this turn for maybe gaining an edge on the future turn. And also, what command cards are you going to play? Like, what units are actually be able to get orders and then make big, powerful plays on that following turn? Because while, again, it might be about trading off a bit of that optimization in the short term for a better turn in the future, if that better turn in the future is worth it, then absolutely trade off, a bit of that tempo now for something further down the line. And yeah, also, especially in Rebels, it's really noticeable, like, if you leave a unit in a position where it can be attacked before it's going to be able to attack, you're going to lose so much value from that unit because you don't have that defensive tech. And with some of the dice pools that are sort of running around now, if you do leave a unit sort of out there, not even that out there, but in a position where it can be attacked early on next turn, it's probably going to die before you get to go. So just thinking about what will happen on the following turn if I leave a unit there, and what if the opponent is able to grab the initiative over me. And my final one is more of sort of thinking about Legion as a game and how you're going to enjoy it in the long term. And like I said earlier, I think Legion isn't for everyone, and it doesn't have to be. And also, like, generically saying that Legion isn't for everybody is maybe a bit simplistic, because there are lots of different ways to enjoy Legion. Like, there is a very sort of strong competitive scene for Legion. There are lots of players who, play hundreds of games and play multiple times a week, for instance, get all those practice games in. But you don't have to enjoy the game by winning. You can play. I'm in a sort of Republic versus Separatist thematic campaign at the moment, and that's been really fun because everyone's kind of running slightly suboptimal lists, but we're all trying to fudge it through and run the best list that we can to have fun in that situation. So that's another variant of enjoying Legion. And then there's also the hobby side, like painting, collecting, building up an army. Like sometimes just getting your completing army out on the table and just seeing all the minis that you spent. You don't have to spend ages painting them if you don't want to, but if you had spent ages painting them, it can be really cool. And sometimes there are painting prizes at events and things like that, and that is an equally valid way to enjoy Legion. It doesn't just have to be about winning and whether or not you can beat someone, because with the exception of a very small number of players, there's always going to be somebody better than you at the game, and maybe defining yourself by how often you win tournaments isn't going to be the most healthy in the long term. But also, it can sometimes just, after a game, if you're chatting to somebody, just think about, did I enjoy this? What would I change about my list? Maybe, make me enjoy the game more. Some people don't enjoy the more tactical side of things, really having to think things through. Some people want just a very melee, brawly list that sort of it's quite obvious what you're going to do, but it has some big potential upsides if you can get those attacks off. And while it may be not the most competitive way to play Legion, that can also be really fun. Just, throwing loads of dice around inherently probably has some enjoyment factor to it. So yeah, not everybody will enjoy Legion in the same way, and I think that's actually part of the beauty of tabletop gaming, is there are so many different ways to approach it. So just because everyone else is maybe doing one thing, don't think you have to fit in with what everybody else is doing. And also don't listen to anonymous people like me on the internet who pretend to know exactly what they're talking about when it comes to Legion, because nobody knows everything. Cool. Well, unfortunately, nothing very specific here to sort of improve your Legion experience. More of a sort of overall look and kind of a holistic view. But if there are any tips you found for enjoying Legion in the long term, absolutely put them in the comments below. I'm happy to do a more specific gameplay based one. I don't know if it would make the best video. It might do. I'm happy to try, but yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below. And we're heading for 1,000 subscribers, which is slightly terrifying to say. I am planning to do something for that. I'm not quite sure what it's going to look like yet, but keep an eye out for that video. But yeah, thank you so much for watching and for subscribing, and I'll see you for the next one.